Dr. Onel Brooks now, who will be responding and also talking about integrate individualism, taking the individual as that around which all else revolves and resolves. And we have 20 minutes for Onel's talk and 10 minutes for questions after it.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there's always a question of which way around I should do it, but I think perhaps what I would do is try and say something about my contribution, which is inveterate individualism, and then try and sort of try and pull things together. So I think of myself as trying to make a contribution to a discussion, to something about individualism, the society and society. And I'm trying to talk about, when I say inveterate individualism, I mean our tendency to regard human beings as not primarily social, but solitary and detached. I think there's a long history of that, and I'm hoping not to go into it. So what I try to do, rather than give you lots of sort of, rather than try and reproduce my paper, I want to sort of try and tell you about it. And one of the things I do with the paper is I start off by introducing a character called Jack. And I say, I try to encourage you. I say, you're his therapist. So I want to encourage you to think a bit about that. Try and imagine you're sitting in front of Jack. And Jack has a lot to say to you. And eventually he says to you, I think a lot about killing someone. I think it'd be great. I think it'd be better than sex. Now, my question to you, my question to you is something about how do you respond to that? One possibility, of course, is to say, well, you better find somebody to report Jack to, because if he's going to kill somebody, he's obviously very dangerous, and that's what you ought to do. Safeguarding and things like that, which I'm not saying here one should never do that. I'm just saying to you, you've got Jack in front of you. He said that. That's one possibility. The other is to sort of, I guess, maybe it's not either or. You might get quite diagnostic and decide that he's probably psychotic, or maybe borderline, or maybe he's just evil, because people say things like, some people are just evil. Maybe you buy that sort of stuff. I want to say that if we go towards a safeguarding sort of option, maybe we are already very much caught up in psychotherapy as a form of surveillance and control of people, rather than the place where someone might come to talk about some of the things that really seem to matter to them. So first of all, I introduce Jack. Then I introduce a slave who keeps on running away. And I want to add, although he's treated quite well, he keeps on running away persistently. And I then say that we can take the path that Descartes took, which is to talk about individuals, talk about subjects, talk about people having consciousness. So Jack has a consciousness, the slave has a consciousness. Jack is a mind in a machine-like body, so is the slave. We're transparent to ourselves and responsible for what we do and all that kind of stuff. And I say that the path that Descartes took is not that dissimilar to the one that Freud takes. Freud says in The Unconscious that I know that I have a consciousness directly, but for you, I have to make an inference. I have to look at what you do and work out whether or not you have a consciousness too. I then say something just very briefly about how two of the most important philosophers of the last century don't take that path. And I mean Heidegger and Wittgenstein. For Heidegger, we are not primarily, for Heidegger and Wittgenstein, we're not primarily subjects standing over objects. I mean, that's all the stuff about proximalian for the most part. Heidegger says, basically, primarily, that's not what we are. We're much more mixed up with things. We're much more, just involved with things in a way that's not reflective. Wittgenstein is saying something similar when he starts to talk. Is he saying something similar? That's always up for discussion, but I take it as something similar when he's trying to say something about language and how language is not primarily about naming objects. It's not, it's not about the subject sort of giving the name to the objects around him, usually him. But language is a sort of activity which is woven into the other activities that we're engaged with as humans. And both Wittgenstein and Heidegger have got things to say about science and technology. And I think, Del, you said something about progress when you started, which which I think is related to that. And Manu commented on it. So I kind of slipped into sort of doing what I said I would do later, but Manu commented on it. And there is Wittgenstein says somewhere, I think in the investigations in the beginning, that the thing about progress is it's not as good as it looks, or something like that. Okay, so I talk about Wittgenstein and Heidegger, and I say I'm trying to bring us back to Jack and the runaway slave. I'm telling you the strategy of the paper. And I think both of them are trying to urge us to, that what they're trying to do is to say, rather than speculate about what might be going on in something called the mind of Jack's mind or the slave's mind, we might look. The mind, brain, psychic apparatus, whatever you want to call it. We might look, we might think, we might describe. So let's say something about Jack, just a bit more. So Jack's family, Jack comes from a family, he's part of a family where a lot of the men have committed crimes. Quite a lot of them are in prison. In fact, it's a badge of honor to go to prison. And quite a few of them have murdered. And the women in the family are quite proud of being part of that family where nobody messes with the men. Even in prison, no one messes with the men because they're pretty tough men. And we might say, well, that doesn't explain everything, but we kind of maybe think about Jack in a slightly different way. Jack has come from that sort of family. And I think I say to you he's about 14, 15. And there's probably quite a bit going on about how much of a man he is and what the hell that means. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say to you, we can look inside Jack's mind, brain, or we can, and maybe we can look at where Jack has come from. We can say something about the family, where the individual members of that family, but ultimately, I think, where have they come from too? What have they experienced? What's the context for our society? Our society, we might think of it as very non-violent. I think that would be a mistake, actually. I think I want to say you've got to look at Jack, the family, the society, the context. The slave who keeps on running away, well, I guess it's possible to look inside the slave's mind to see, or his brain, or whatever you want to call it, and say that there's something wrong with him for wanting to run away as he tends to. The slave, actually, I mean, this is something in the States, I probably remember the dates, but the slaves were diagnosed with something some of you may know or recall, called drapetomania. Drapetomania is a condition. It was said like that, and it was offered as some sort of medical term that explains that the slave has an uncontrollable urge to escape from slavery. Of course, one question is, why does that need to be explained? What needs to be explained around there? And I think we are talking about looking into attempting to look into and speculate about the individual's mind or brain. By the way, one of the ways you could cure a slave with drapetomania is to beat the slave severely and or cut off both of his big toes, in which case he wouldn't run, because he bloody well couldn't. So I think that this is an example of how we might use scientific, medical, diagnostic terms as a way of not thinking about what we're doing, as a way of not looking at the society in which we're a part of. Because I think people who had an interest in the institution of slavery were very keen to keep the thing going. So I do say something about institutional racism here very quickly. It's about the fact that our inveterate individualism makes it very difficult for us to think about institutional racism, because we get caught up in the saying, I'm not racist, this isn't racist, I never thought of that. But that's not what institutional racism means. It's not trying to sort of say something about what's going on inside an individual. It's trying to say something about a system which has been said just a little bit earlier, and I think said very well. So maybe we'll come back to some of those things. What I do is I say something very quickly about people like Fuchs, who's a group analyst, and Fuchs said something about how the individual is an abstraction, and individuals are determined by the world in which they live, the community, the group. I think determined is too strong. It's much too strong. But I think that Fuchs is important because he he overturns the thing that we perhaps are more likely to think. The idea is that the individual is concrete, obvious, and the groups might be a bit more abstract and a bit more nebulous. Fuchs is trying to say something more about, it's the individual is an abstraction from the group. I also mentioned Winnicott, and that is to do with, there's no such thing as a baby. There's a maternal care the baby is part of, and how the baby becomes a unit just in relation to what's going on with the baby and the mother. Now, I think that's probably, as Manu was commenting on, I think earlier, this is perhaps also too individualistic and too atomistic. But I think Winnicott at least moves towards something which is about the group or the society. I also just say a few things, not very much about Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, which is just to say that I think that when they're talking about being individuals, they are not talking about the individualism that I'm trying to say something against. I think they're trying to say something about how becoming an individual is some sort of achievement. that it's actually more of a lifelong process to become an individual. So but anyway, so said all of that stuff, but now I want to sort of say a number of criticisms that can be made, because I think it's impossible to say anything about this without lots of criticisms and buts and ands, which, but most things I think that's true. The first sort of criticism is that not enough attention has been paid to something like safeguarding. I should have spoken a lot more about that kind of stuff. That's what some people might say. The second is I'm not really saying anything more than that we need to take the social context into consideration. The third is that these brief comments, there's no point making them. They could be expanded, and therefore they should be expanded. And the last thing is, don't worry, I'm going to say them all again. The last thing is that the paper repeats many things that have already been said. So most of you would have heard most of the stuff I've already said. So whether or not this paper doesn't say enough about safeguarding, I think that helps us to think about the point of writing the paper. The point of writing the paper is something about how we tend to go towards safeguarding and what's the problem with the individual, as opposed to what context is the individual in. And I want to say to you, the paper does not say, and I don't say, I was this person's individual therapist. I want to say to you, there are all sorts of possibilities. Supervisees, therapists, maybe. It could be someone seen in the therapeutic community, in a group, in a children's home, all sorts of possibilities. What exactly it is doesn't really matter. The question is, how do we think about that encounter with Jad? It's also possible that the person who comes to see you or me or someone in a group or a therapeutic community is talking to us about Jack. It's not them. We could say, of course, we know from a safeguarding point of view that actually he's really talking about himself, and we ought to sort of report him to somebody. We could say that sort of stuff. I don't, anyway. Just a couple of things very quickly. A man might say to you that he gets into the bath on a regular basis with his 3-year-old daughter, and you could think, well, someone should report that because obviously that's not the right thing to do. Or a woman you're seeing might say to you, this man that she lives with or that she's with, who's been physically abusive to her, she might say to you, sometimes I feel like killing him. And of course, you might think that the best thing to do is that you need to go and report her because she might do something. I'm just sort of throwing all of that stuff at you because obviously I think the whole safeguarding thing is not just rubbish, but I think we have to have a certain amount of time and listening to what the clients have to say rather than this sort of knee-jerk thing about we just have to report them. So the second thing I want to say very quickly, as criticism of the thing that I've written, is that I'm only trying to say we need to think about the social context. I don't think that's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say something about how we need to turn away from something and turn towards something. And Achille Mbembe, who is an African political theorist, actually, he writes somewhere that the ill human being is a human being without a family, without love, without relations, without communications, without community. I mean, he's trying to say illness, as he's sort of talking about it, is something about how much we might be isolated, cut off from other people, and not feel part of the community. And anyway, and he says unable to make authentic encounters with others, to have those sort of encounters with others. And the third thing is about the paper should be expanded because there's much more that could be said. Well, I think the idea that if something could be expanded, it should be expanded, probably should help us to think about something called capitalism or colonialism. And there is a I won't go into that because I probably will run out of time, but there are questions about whether or not everything that could be expanded should be expanded. The last thing is about repetition. But of course I'm repeating. Of course I'm introducing Jack, and then I'm introducing the philosophers, and then I'm going back to Jack, and now I'm coming back to the whole business about repetition. And I'm coming back to the idea that we need to go back to Jack and think again about Jack, and then think about the paper. I think that in any sort of exchange with people in therapy, or generally speaking, that we repeat ourselves a lot. We say all the sort of things that people around us say. I'm making a reference which I shouldn't take for granted to say Bion's paper in what's the Notes of Memory and Desire, where he says the only thing that's of value is what's unconscious. And I'm not sure I believe any of that. I think that a lot of things we say have been said, and we probably need to say again and again. And there's something about working through the things that we say, trying to get to understand them. Sometimes it takes us a while. Anyway, I've rushed through this, but that's the sort of thing that I've written.
Thank you so much. Now, perhaps we could have any questions or comments. We want to break.
Onel, you mentioned about, thank you very much. Such a creative way it's done. You mentioned about surveillance.
Yes.
Isn't that part of a more broader role of perhaps of psychotherapy, which is of socialization? Or anything to say with regard to that?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that. Is it a broader role? I think we're probably much more caught up in it than we should be. And I think I say I worry about it. I worry about what I don't report and what I don't say. But I think that if we don't have that space, then we may as well pack it in a way.
I think what I was trying to say, so I'm not explaining very well, is that aren't we also involved much more broadly as psychotherapists in socializing people to fit into our society? That safeguarding is a kind of more maybe clear example of it. But isn't there a way of just how people move in the world with others, that we're sort of helping them fit into that, to the world that they're born into, thrown into?
Yes, yeah, but I suppose I think that there's a benign and a malign sort of version of that, isn't there? There is a sort of, I think that much of what we're up to is trying to help people to move from being sort of shut up and silent and constricted to being able to sort of speak a bit, and there are ways of doing that, which I think, that involves, what I'm saying about repetition, we probably say all kinds of things to them which are not particularly creative or new, but there's something about, do we get a conversation going with them, and can we do that? Or are we more, let's say, more invested in them sort of being able to speak in a particular way, or something like that? Which I think the latter is much more malign, and who knows whether or not anyone can claim that they only do the former rather than the latter. I think that's part of a problem, isn't it, for us?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because there's that sort of what Sally was talking about with libérance, about the getting the words now, with regard to the
Getting the sorry?
I'm forgetting the right words, the idea of finding one's voice and being assertive and autonomy and things like that, And when do we, if at all, see it as in terms of heteronomy, in terms of where it's putting the other first, and where do our own values and our own socialization through not only the way we're brought up, but the kind of psychotherapy trainings we've done, where does that take on the values of our society, or forces in our society which may not always be helpful?
But I think they must be right that those things. Yeah, I think even our socialization, our training, probably certainly inclines us towards towards interacting with our clients in certain ways, and probably saying all sorts of things to them. But the question is, I don't think ever it's going to be about whether or not we can stop that. The question is about whether or not we're able to sort of reflect on that, I think, and whether or not that's open to reflection from us, or to, I guess, us and the people that we feel that we can talk about those things to. I think.
Thank you.
This making me think about Foucault's critique really of the kind of discourse of the unconscious, that even in the very use of this theory, there is something that gets hidden and promoted as being not spoken of or to, and then how we then speak about these things in private places outside of the world. Yeah, I mean, it's always a critique. I think it's an interesting one to kind of hold in mind.
Do you think that when Foucault says that sort of stuff, I mean, it's really interesting that there is something, isn't there, about how maybe it doesn't, maybe whatever language that you try to use, there's a question about where it takes you. It gives your exchange, your conversation, a direction.
I mean, this is, yes, and that's the interesting thing around Wittgenstein, isn't it? I think the kind of which language are we speaking with, and maybe the interesting bit is where that doesn't meet in a way, where we sort of, it kind of falls apart. I don't know. I think there's something important about that, about where it doesn't quite hold, maybe.
So do you mean for the client that?
Well, I suppose that's how I think, because it unsettles something about the kind of discourse we're embedded in, that I suppose Heidegger says we're thrown into the world. So I see that as quite an important ethical position. I mean, one thing I was going to ask you, you said about Fuchs saying we're kind of determined by the world, and you thought that was sort of far too strong. So I was kind of interested more around that, really.
Yeah. I felt that to say that we're determined by the world sounds a bit too scientific and mathematical immediately, because I don't know about determined, and I think that maybe I'm just sort of trying to sort of wriggle where there's no room to wriggle, but I think there's something, isn't there? It's about the influences on us, and the things that help us to do what we do are so varied and so subtle. And that maybe I'm arguing with you that it's about determinism, but I'm saying I think to say determined actually just nails it down too much. That our interactions with people, what we read, all that sort of stuff, I think I think determine. I just want to say determine is too strong. I mean, it's twins, for example. That won't work either. That won't work. I'm just saying that if we had two people who were twins, there will be differences between them. And do you think the differences are caused and determined? I don't know. I don't believe it. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I suppose even with twins, their place in the world is amongst others, one of them being their twin. You know, I guess, yeah, I guess what we're all looking for is where the wiggle room is. You know, where is the room for something that can emerge?
Do you think two twins who are identical and who behave pretty much the same might have two different conversations, or rather, come away from a conversation with different thoughts?
Yes.
Yes. And the question is whether or not they were determined to do that, forced to do that, or determined to do that, or whether or not that's determined is not the concept that really gets what's happened. I don't know.
I suppose I see it all as a response, in a sense. Responsibility for our response to the world, to others, to. So I probably, I agree the word determines is something a bit troubling about this word. But I don't know if the wiggle room's there, I suppose, is what I'm wondering.
You might be right, but I think that the determined sounds a bit like a hammer to me. You know, it's a bit, and it sounds as if we might be still talking about science or mathematics. And I think that prompts me to worry about whether or not it's too heavy.
I'm just thinking about that, Onel. I'm thinking about just going back to Winnicott in a way, going back to this notion of the baby.
Yes.
You know, and the dyad, and you know, I think you're right about the notion of determination. It's just too strong a word, isn't it? Because there's something about, I don't know. And I think it's like society as well. There is going to be something, isn't there, that happens for us as a result of the society that we are born into.
Yes.
Like the result of the family that we're born into.
Yes.
And we'll never know, will we? You know, what it would have been like for us to be born into something else. We'll just never know, because we are of that. We are thrown into this particular world.
Yeah.
So I think it's like, on the one hand, there's that influence, but there's still the possibility of something happening in relation to the way in which our relational gestures are interpreted. But it's society and the parent that sort of does that, isn't it?
Yes.
You know, so that it's not determining, or maybe it is, I don't know, however you want to look at it, but it's just the way in which, you know, we experience this particular world and our response to it.
Yes. No, thank you. That helps me to think a bit, because of course there is something, as you say, about the gestures we make, how they're responded to, and then there's something about how we interpret the response, isn't there? There's something about the sort of subtleties that go on, and I guess we could sort of try and invoke Sartre, couldn't we? As to say that there's the whole thing about if we talk about determines, it's more like that we're trying to think that we are somehow a being in itself or something like that, rather than a being for ourselves. You know, there's something that we can't. It's like we don't want responsibility for it. We want to say, look, that just determines me. It's like Sartre and the man who says, you know, okay, that child is drowning in the river, but I can't jump in there and save him because I'm a coward. Do you see that?
Sure. I suppose it's like the young person who wants to have the ADHD diagnosis so that they don't have to have responsibility.